Hello everyone. Today we will be covering the top 10 mistakes that entrepreneurs make. Before we go ahead, let me tell you a bit about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is the field of study where lots of industry-renowned researchers have done extensive work. But in spite of all that work, we do not know for sure what makes a startup succeed or fail. However, we do know that if entrepreneur sidesteps certain mistakes, if entrepreneur does certain list of things, he or she significantly improve their odds of succeeding in their venture. And that's exactly the reason why we are starting this particular course with top 10 mistakes every entrepreneur makes. Because by just avoiding these mistakes, you're significantly improving your odds of success. Bear in mind, you're not guaranteed to succeed, because that's the state of entrepreneurship. We do not know much about entrepreneurship to tell for sure that if you follow a certain rule A, B, C, you will succeed in a venture. But however, if you avoid making these mistakes, you will significantly improve your odds of success. So today we'll be covering the most important mistakes that startups make. We'll be talking about how you as an entrepreneur could avoid making those mistakes. And the concepts that we'll be covering today include a list of very important concepts like the notion of fit between the entrepreneur and the startup and the overall context, business model generation, business plan, financial forecasting, bootstrapping a venture, and a list of other things too. But before we go ahead and get our hands dirty, let's watch this video from someone I think you might recognize.
I'm wondering what would be the single most valuable piece of advice you'd give us to even attempt to create some of the value that you guys have done in both your very impressive companies.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit.
Let's move on to the next mistake that entrepreneurs make. Now, entrepreneurs come up with a great idea. They get excited, but then they stop. They tend to think that my technology product is so earth-shattering that it requires a huge investment from the biggest venture capital in the industry. Unless and until I get that round of investment, I cannot even move a muscle. That is a major flaw. Almost every startup has a chance of succeeding, or at least beginning to pursue the opportunity with limited financial resource. Through a process of trial and error, through a process of starting small and growing gradually, you can certainly start a venture irrespective of how earth-shattering or revolutionary your product offering is. Now, what can an entrepreneur do in that instance? As you can see, these are the stages of a startup. First is pre-seed. Then you have the seed round, which is the startup phase. And then you have the early life cycle of the startup. Then you have the later phase of the startup. As you can tell, there are different classes of investors who are interested in different stages of the startup. Obviously, the pre-seed, the founder would have to rely on his or her own savings, his family funds, his friends, in order to fund the startup. When he has funded the startup and he has something to prove, he could potentially seek investment from angel investors. These are investors who are not venture capitalists. they address a particular gap in the financing phase, which is between pre-seed and early phase. These are angel investors who are previously startup entrepreneurs, who are serial entrepreneurs, who have made a ton of money. They want to invest their own money in certain startups that they find themselves interested in. And then you also have certain government-sponsored funds who are acting in this particular space. It's only in the early phase of the startup that venture capitalists are interested in even listening to your pitch. When you are here, when you are a 500K company and you seek investment from venture capitalists, they won't even respond to your email messages. It's only when you have this much of a finance need, they feel it makes it that much more relevant for them to even look at your business plan. And in the later phase, you have your private equity, which involves other pension funds that might be interested, or insurance companies that might be interested in investing their fund in your company. So the demand also varies significantly, because when you're starting, your demand for fund is marginal, which is probably 100,000 just to get started. Obviously, this is in US dollars. And then in the angel investor space, as I told you before, your fund requirement is enough to not be met by family or friends, but at the same time, it's not enough to pick the venture capitalist's interest. And finally, it's only when you reach a finance need of 5 to 10 million that venture capitalists would be interested in your startup. And later, you have rounds going as high as 20 million or even up to 50 million. And then the supply side of this particular equation is that you have supply coming in from founders and families in the pre-seed stage, whereas there is an equity gap between the pre-seed and the early stage, where most companies linger for quite some time, and you need funding. When you cannot find angel investors, when you cannot find VCs, what are you supposed to do? You cannot just sit on your hands telling yourself that I have to somehow bring my company up to this stage where I can get the VC's interest, and until then I cannot do anything. Well, there are ways for you to bridge the gap, going from 500K to $5 to $10 million. That's called bootstrapping. Now, before we look at ways of how an entrepreneur can bridge that gap, let's take a moment and think about different sources of funding, their advantages and disadvantages. Now, when you look at class of funding, there are two classes broadly. One is equity funding, the other one is debt funding. That's exactly what we have here. On the left-hand side, you have your equity funding, and on the right-hand side, you have your debt funding. The good thing about equity funding is that these are value-added investors. What I mean by value-added investors is that they don't just put their money. They put their money and they invest their time in the startup by giving important advices. They have a say on how the company is run. On top of that, they bring in network wealth, that is the context, which could be crucial for the success of a startup. So those are the advantages of equity funding. The other main advantage as compared with debt funding is that in equity funding, you don't have to make cash outflow, which is payment. If it's a debt, you have to make principal payment and interest payments on a regular basis. Whereas for a startup, cash flow is extremely important, and whatever cash you can retain in your startup, it will help succeed that particular startup. So in equity funding, you don't have to make a cash outflow as often as you would do in a debt funding. The disadvantages of equity funding is the fact that there is an advisor who is constantly breathing down your neck. They influence almost every business decision. And for an entrepreneur who is wanting that freedom, that could be a limiting factor. Moving on to the debt funding, the advantage is that you don't have that advisor. You don't have someone telling you how to run your business. You don't have to give up ownership or control of your business. Whereas the disadvantage in the debt funding is that you have to make that payment on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis based on how the debt is structured. And for a startup, that could be a huge stress. So those are the trade-offs in different sources of funding, and it's exactly the reason why most of the startups stick to equity funding, because they like the advantages that comes along with equity funding, which is not having to make that regular periodic payment. They want to retain the cash. And on top of that, they are value-added investors. They need the contact. The entrepreneurs need the contact that the advisors bring to the table.